Bibliophiles of the internet, today I'm back to redeem myself by recommending even more non-binary romances. Hello, in case you don't know me, I am an actual trans-masc non-binary person whose pronouns are they, them, and a couple of years ago I made a video recommending non-binary romance books. But I wanted to make an updated version of that video because I think I can do better. I can weed out certain race-faking authors who slipped past my notice at the time, if you know, you know, and because there are even more romances out there now by and about non-binary folks. And I also just want to preface this by saying I'm making this video because I know a lot of people enjoy reading stories about queer romance during Pride Month, which is great, but I also just want to say that you can find books about and by non-binary folks in every single genre and subgenre you can possibly think of. And also, non-binary people's stories and value is not tied to our romantic relationships or lack thereof. With all that said, let's start by rapid firing through some of the titles from my old video that you should still know about and have on your radar. There were more titles than this in the original video, by the way, even books that I would still recommend in general, but some of them I felt weren't technically romances in the most traditional definition of the genre, so the list has been pared down a little bit. But first we have Ander and Santi Were Here by Johnny Garzavia. This is a YA romance and coming-of-age story about a Mexican-American non-binary artist named Ander who is taking a gap year before going to art school, and their family decides to help give them more time to build out their portfolio by firing them from the family taqueria. But of course, Ander still has to help train their own replacement, who happens to be a hot new waiter named Santi. Then we have another book I actually recommended recently in my video where I recommend books for nearly every prompt on the Round 15 Queer Lit Readathon bingo board, and that is The One True Me and You by Remy K. England. This is a contemporary YA romance about a non-binary fanfic writer named Kay, who's going to this nerdy convention with their friends called Great Con, and Kay wants to do 3 things over the weekend. Try out they/them pronouns, wear a masculine presenting cosplay, and hopefully kiss a girl for the very first time. I also still very much recommend Spellbound by F.T. Lukens, which is a YA paranormal fantasy and romance about 2 rival apprentice sorcerers who end up having to team up to save their mentors and protect their magic when one of them is discovered as harboring an illegal magical detection device. On the adult side of things, I still recommend Love and Other Disasters by Anita Kelly, which is a romance set against the backdrop of a culinary competition show where a recent divorcee determined to find herself again begins falling for her fellow contestant, who happens to be the first openly non-binary contestant on a reality cooking show. Another fave that I still think is dramatically underrated is Unmasked by the Marquess by Cat Sebastian. I believe it's a Regency romance about a young man named Robert Selby who is not actually a man, but rather a non-binary housemaid named Robin in disguise, who is desperate to find an advantageous marriage match for her sister before she finally retires this facade. Using this disguise, Robin decides to make the acquaintance of Alistair, the wealthy Marquis of Pembroke, who actually has been struggling to repair the ruined estate he inherited from his father. But even though he wants nothing more than to protect his fortune and family name, he does find himself incredibly charmed by this young man named Robert who shows up on his doorstep. Now let's get into the newer additions to this list, starting with the YA books and then moving on to adult. First we have This Feast of a Life by Cynthia So. This is both a coming-of-age story and a romance about a non-binary character named Auden, who is not only going by their new chosen name for the first time, but also starting a new food blog to share their passion for food and cooking. Then there's Valerie, who unfortunately lost her mother, and she wants to find a way to reconnect with her dad again through cooking for and with each other, and that's how she discovers Auden's blog. There's also a book called All About Romance by Daniel Toss, which is about a non-binary teenager named Roman who lives in a small town and has yet to have their first big romantic experience. But then they start finding these anonymous postcards in their locker and around school, and they hope the postcards are coming from their mega crush / almost boyfriend. But it looks like Roman might just have to make the first move themselves. Circling back to F.T. Lukens and another book I recommended recently, you should also check out Otherworldly by F.T. Lukens. This is another YA paranormal romance about a non-binary teenager named Ellery who does not believe in magic, but lives in a small town that's been cursed and stuck in a winter that's lasted for 5 years. One day they run into Nox, a familiar from the other world, and they end up making a bargain with each other. Ellery will help Nox experience all the wonders of the human world, and Nox will help Ellery find a way to break the town's curse. A graphic novel I read for last December's round of the Queer Lit Readathon and would also recommend is I Shall Never Fall in Love by Harry Connor. This is a queer historical romance, very Jane Austen inspired. It's about a trans-masked non-binary character named George who recently inherited their family's failing estate. And to make things worse, George is also grappling with their confusing feelings for Eleanor, their best friend. And when a new wealthy suitor comes to town intent on courting Eleanor, George begins feeling oddly threatened, and the two of them will have to confront the true nature of their relationship. Okay, the rest of these books are adult titles from here on out, and to kick us off, I recently learned about a historical romance called An Unsuitable Heir by K.J. Charles. This is technically the third book in a series that the author does recommend reading in publication order, but for posterity, I'm gonna share it anyways. It's a blend of mystery and romance about a private detective named Mark, who is hired to track down an aristocrat's secret heir, who happens to perform as a trapeze artist. This trapeze artist, Penn Starling, has no interest in living as a man, much less as a nobleman, and he refuses to accept his title or change his way of life. But there is a killer stalking the streets of London, and it turns out that more lives than just Penn's are at stake. I've also heard really great things about Single Player by Tara Tai. This is pitched as a queer enemies to lovers workplace romance, and it follows Kat, who writes romantic storylines for video games. Andy, on the other hand, is the game's narrative director who is determined to prove themselves as a serious name in the gaming industry and often clashes with Kat because they don't want to include any romantic story beats. However, one of their investors wants them to add more romance to the game they're currently working on in order to appeal to female gamers, and so Andy is forced to give Kat a real chance, in more ways than one. Another recently published non-binary romance is My Best Friend's Honeymoon by Meryl Wilsner. This is about Elsie, who's been engaged to her college boyfriend for a year and a half, and she discovers that her fiancé has planned out their entire wedding and honeymoon without her input as a surprise, and now she is expected to walk down the aisle in 7 days. Naturally, she does not take this news well and immediately calls off the wedding, breaks off the engagement, and jets off with her best friend Ginny to enjoy the non-refundable honeymoon. And of course, they discover that the two of them might be a much better match. Another book that's been constantly recommended to me and also rated pretty highly is They Ain't Proper by M.B. Guell. It's a historical romance set against the backdrop of the Wild West. It's following Lou, a humble rancher who wants nothing more than to live a quiet, solitary life on the outskirts of town. But those plans are ruined when a housewife is suddenly delivered to their door. Florence is desperate to resolve her family's debt, and she thinks the best way to do that is to sell her services as a wife. And though she is expecting a harsh man to be her new husband, she finds Lou to be a pleasant surprise. Next is Homegrown Magic, co-written by Jamie Pacton and Rebecca Podos. This is like a cozy queer fantasy romance about Yale, who is the only scion of an obscenely wealthy family. But before they can walk into the life their family has curated for them, they decide to leave it behind and run away. Margot, on the other hand, is a talented plant witch trying to salvage what's left of her family's magical remedy business, and when her childhood friend and former crush, Yale, suddenly comes back into her life, she realizes they might just make a good assistant in the greenhouses. Another book I haven't read but I believe fits this prompt is The Pairing by Casey McQuiston. This is supposed to be a romantic comedy about two bisexual exes who book an extravagant European food and wine tour together while they're still dating, but then they're not actually able to go on the trip because they break up. 4 years pass, and then they both coincidentally decide to book a do-over trip on that very same food and wine tour, and then they find themselves trapped on a bus with each other for 3 weeks. Switching gears to a paranormal cozy romance, there's also The Most Unusual Haunting of Edgar Lovejoy by Rowan Parrish. The main character, Jamie, who is a trans-masked non-binary person, actually creates haunted houses for a living, but they don't actually believe in ghosts. Edgar, on the other hand, is 100% convinced that he is haunted. He's been tormented by ghosts ever since he was a child, and he spends most of his life trying to avoid them at all costs. The synopsis doesn't actually say how the two cross paths. Maybe they're assigned to work on the same haunted house together, but it's supposed to be a classic opposites attract romance with a spooky twist. I mentioned Anita Kelly earlier, and I know they also have a non-binary romance novella called Sing Anyway, which is about a non-binary history professor who's sworn off love after a long string of failed relationships. But when all of their friends abandon them at their favorite queer club, they catch the eye of their ultimate karaoke crush. I've also heard really wonderful things about the graphic novel series Grand Slam Romance by Ollie Hicks and Emma Osterhaus. This series is said to blend romance, softball, and the magical girl genre. It's about these two softball players, Astra and Mickey, who seem to have a great relationship until Astra dumps Mickey to go play softball at a private school in Switzerland. Years later, both of them have made a name for themselves in the softball scene, and they're both thrown off their game when they encounter each other once more, playing for rival teams. You know I love a good queer sports romance, so that's all I need to know. The last book I'm going to recommend for today was one of my favorite books of 2024. That is, of course, The Palace of Eros by Guero de Robertes. I will make a distinction here and say that this is not a book I would classify as a capital R romance, but it is deeply, deeply romantic. This is a retelling of the Greek myth between Psyche and Eros. Psyche is an incredibly beautiful human who's caught the attention of lecherous men far and wide, much to the dismay of the goddess Aphrodite, who is incredibly jealous. As recompense for her sins, the oracle convinces Psyche's family to tie her to a rock at the top of a cliff and leave her there to die at the hands of a monstrous beast. But much to her surprise, Psyche is actually saved by Aphrodite's non-binary offspring, Eros, who whisks her away to this miraculous palace far from the eyes of humans and gods. Again, not to editorialize too much, but if you want to read a story about a sweeping, all-consuming romance that also explores the transformative power of love, this is the one. So that is my updated list of non-binary romances for you to check out. Most of these are TradPub because that's just where I tend to read from most, but I assure you if you broaden your search to the indie space, you will find so many more titles than this. Of course, this is not intended to be a definitive list, so if you have any other recommendations for non-binary romances, feel free to share them with everyone down below in the comments. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you found something new to read. And until next time, educate yourself, be kind to yourself, take care of yourself and others, and I will catch you on the flip side of the page.